The sirens were the first thing Evelyn Carter remembered from that day. They sliced through the crisp October morning, louder than she'd ever heard them before, and in that instant she knew her world was about to end. 15 years had passed since then, but the memory of that day still clung to her like the chill in Vermont's autumn air. It had begun so normally. Her husband, Mark, had promised 7-year-old Noah they'd go fishing at the small lake just outside Burlington. Noah had been awake before dawn, his little tackle box clutched tight, his excitement spilling into every word. Evelyn had kissed them both goodbye at the door, watching them walk down the street with their laughter trailing behind. She never imagined it would be the last time she'd see them together. The phone call came an hour later. A truck had swerved on the slick highway, skidding across the lane and crashing into their car. Mark had been killed instantly. Noah was alive, barely, and being rushed into emergency surgery at Massachusetts Children's Hospital. Evelyn's knees buckled beneath her as the officer spoke. The rest of that day dissolved into a blur of flashing lights, antiseptic halls, and the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. In the ICU, Noah lay still beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, his skin too pale, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the machines. Evelyn clung to his tiny hand, whispering over and over that Mommy was here, that he was safe, that he just needed to wake up. But Noah never opened his eyes again. After 48 agonizing hours, the doctors told her what she already feared. There was no brain activity. Her son, her whole reason for breathing, was gone. Then came a question that shattered what little remained of her strength. A surgeon, his voice gentle but clinical, explained that there was a boy Noah's age waiting for a heart transplant. Without it, he would die within days. Noah's heart, they said, was strong. It could save another child's life. Evelyn stared at them, numb. How could they ask her to make that decision when her world had just collapsed? The night that followed was endless. She sat beside Noah's bed, fingers tracing the soft curls at his temple, replaying every laugh, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. How could a life so bright be reduced to this? As dawn crept through the hospital windows, Evelyn finally understood. Noah's story didn't have to end here. Even if she would never again hear his laugh echo through their tiny apartment, a part of him could still live on, beating inside another chest, carrying his light forward. Her voice trembled when she signed the papers. "Please," she whispered to the doctor, "make sure it goes to someone who will live a full, beautiful life." The hours that followed were the most excruciating of her existence. Evelyn held Noah close one last time, pressing her forehead to his and breathing in the faint scent of soap and sunshine that still lingered on his skin. "You're not leaving me," she murmured through tears. "You're just going somewhere I can't follow. Keep living, my love. Even if you're not here, keep living." When the surgical team wheeled him away, the silence that followed was unbearable. The walls seemed to close in, the hospital lights too bright, the world too cruel. Evelyn stumbled out into the cold October morning, clutching the small wooden horse she'd carved for Noah on his 5th birthday, the toy he had refused to go anywhere without. It was all she had left. 15 years later, that day still haunted her. It was the moment her life split into before and after. Before, she had a husband, a son, a future filled with birthday cakes and fishing trips. After, she had a disability check that barely covered the rent, odd cleaning jobs that left her aching, and a 1-bedroom apartment crammed with memories she couldn't bear to throw away. But she carried on, not because she was strong, but because somewhere out there, Noah's heart was still beating. And that heartbeat was the only thing that kept hers going too. 15 years had passed, yet for Evelyn Carter, time had not healed anything. It had only deepened the silence. The apartment she had once shared with her husband and son now felt like a mausoleum. Every creak of the floorboards, every dent on the kitchen table a relic of a life that no longer existed. She never remarried. She couldn't. The idea of starting over with someone else felt like a betrayal to the boy whose heart still beat somewhere out there. So she withdrew instead, closing herself off from the world. Friends stopped calling. The neighbors barely remembered her name. Evelyn existed in the shadow of who she once was, moving through each day as if it were another weight to carry rather than a life to be lived. Her days settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Each morning, she woke before sunrise and made tea in the same chipped mug Noah had painted in kindergarten. She walked to the corner store for discounted groceries, then returned to her one-bedroom apartment, where faded photographs lined the walls like silent witnesses. In the evenings, she sat by the window and watched the lights flicker on across Burlington, wondering if any of those homes held the boy who now carried her son's heart. But grief was not the only thing pressing down on her. The disability check she received each month barely covered the rent, and the small cleaning jobs she picked up around the neighborhood paid just enough to keep the lights on. Some months she had to choose between groceries and medication. And now, a letter taped to her door threatened the fragile balance she had managed to hold together, a notice from her landlord warning of eviction if she didn't catch up on the rent she owed. Evelyn stared at the paper for a long time, her hands trembling. 15 years ago, she had lost everything that mattered. Now, she was about to lose the little that remained. She spent that night sitting awake in the dark, staring at the wooden horse perched on the shelf, Noah's toy, her most precious possession. She whispered to it like she used to whisper to her son, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." 2 weeks later, an unexpected opportunity arrived like a crack of light through a closed door. A woman from a cleaning agency called to offer her a position. Part-time housekeeping for a wealthy family in the Boston suburbs, the Hargroves. The pay was far better than anything she'd earned in years, and it included transportation. Evelyn hesitated. She had spent so long hiding from the world, and the thought of entering the home of strangers, especially people whose lives had likely never brushed against tragedy, filled her with dread. But eviction was no longer a distant threat. It was at her doorstep. She didn't have the luxury of pride. 3 days later, she found herself on a train heading south. The ride to Boston felt like traveling to another planet. Burlington's modest streets and peeling porches faded into the distance, replaced by sprawling estates, manicured lawns, and wrought iron gates. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the glass and tried not to think about how small she must look to people who lived like this. When the taxi dropped her off at the Hargroves estate, Evelyn stood frozen at the edge of the driveway. The mansion loomed above her, pale stone walls, arched windows, ivy crawling up the sides like nature trying to claim what wealth had built. The gardens were sculpted with mathematical precision, and the air smelled faintly of roses and old money. She clutched her worn canvas bag tighter and took a shaky breath. This world was not meant for her. She was a woman who had once walked hospital corridors barefoot because she'd forgotten to put on shoes after her son's death. She was someone who'd cried into second-hand pillowcases and measured time by anniversaries of loss. And yet here she was, about to step into a life that had never known that kind of pain. The door opened before she could knock. A woman in a crisp blouse and tailored slacks, Lillian Hargrove, stood there, her expression polite but distant. Evelyn swallowed hard and forced a small nod as she stepped inside. The marble floors gleamed under her worn shoes, the chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars, and the silence of the place felt different from her own. Not heavy with grief, but with power. Evelyn told herself this was just a job, a temporary solution to a practical problem. But as she followed Lillian deeper into the mansion, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that she was crossing a threshold far more significant than she realized. Somewhere beyond these walls, life was about to change again, not with the crash of sirens this time, but with a heartbeat she had once known. The first thing Evelyn noticed about Lillian Hargrove was how still she was. The woman stood in the grand marble foyer like a portrait, immaculately dressed in cream and charcoal, posture perfect, eyes sharp enough to cut through glass. "You're the new housekeeper?" she asked, her tone cool and measured. Evelyn nodded. clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag. "Yes, ma'am." Lillian's gaze swept over her like she was assessing a piece of furniture. "We expect our home to be maintained to a certain standard," she said, gesturing toward the sweeping staircase and polished oak railings. "Floors spotless, surfaces free of dust, silver polished weekly. I don't tolerate shortcuts or excuses. If something is beyond your abilities, you tell me. Immediately." Evelyn murmured that she understood, but Lillian wasn't finished. "One more thing," she added, voice dropping slightly. "My son, Julian, lives here as well. He's very busy with his studies and doesn't need distractions. Please keep your interactions with him to a minimum." The word stung more than Evelyn expected. She wasn't in the habit of talking to anyone these days, let alone wealthy strangers, but the way Lillian said it, as if Evelyn's presence itself might be a nuisance, reminded her painfully of how small she felt in this world. She lowered her eyes and nodded again. "Of course." The days that followed slipped into a new rhythm. Evelyn spent hours dusting endless bookshelves, polishing brass fixtures, scrubbing tiled floors that gleamed like mirrors. The work was exhausting, but she didn't complain. It was work that paid, and for now that was enough. Still, she felt the weight of the house pressing in on her. The silence too deep, the hallways too long, the portraits of ancestors staring down from the walls like silent judges. Then, one afternoon, while she was wiping down the banister on the second floor, a voice startled her. "You must be Evelyn." She turned to see a young man standing at the end of the hall, dressed casually in jeans and a soft gray sweater, his expression open and warm in a way that clashed with the house's cold grandeur. "I'm Julian," he said, offering a smile that reached his eyes. "Sorry if my mom scared you off. She's very particular." Evelyn chuckled softly despite herself. "I gathered that." Julian leaned against the wall, studying her with a curious tilt of his head. "I'm an architecture student, final year at MIT. I'm supposed to be drafting a project right now, but I've been staring at a blank page all morning. You ever have days like that?" Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by how easily he spoke to her, as if she weren't just the help. "More than I can count," she replied quietly. After that, she began to see Julian more often. Sometimes he'd pass through the kitchen with a cup of coffee and ask about her day. Other times, he'd nod politely as she vacuumed the living room and returned to his sketchbook. But the moment that carved itself into her heart came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Evelyn was dusting the parlor when Julian sat down at the grand piano in the corner and began to play. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she hadn't heard in years. The melody was tender and aching, each note falling like a whisper into the room. Evelyn froze mid-motion, the rag slipping from her hand as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know why she was crying. Maybe it was the way the music seemed to reach into some locked place inside her, or the strange, almost familiar ache in her chest as she watched Julian's fingers glide across the keys. When the last note faded, Julian glanced over and noticed her standing there, eyes glistening. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said softly. Evelyn swallowed hard, managing a nod. "Yes, it is." Later that evening, as she folded linens in the laundry room, her colleague Martha Green joined her, a sturdy woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "You like the boy," Martha said knowingly. Evelyn shook her head quickly. "I don't even know him." Martha smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter. People feel it when a soul is good. Julian's a good one, but he's been through more than you'd think. Sickly as a child, doctors weren't sure he'd make it. And Lillian," Martha paused, her eyes softening. "She lost a baby once. A little girl. Heart condition. Never got over it." Evelyn stood still, the words settling heavy in the room. Julian, frail as a child. A mother who had once watched her baby slip away because of a failing heart. The ache in her chest deepened, though she couldn't explain why. She only knew that something about this house, about this boy, was pulling at a thread buried deep inside her, one that hadn't been touched in 15 years. The afternoon light slanted gently through Julian's bedroom windows, casting golden stripes across the polished wood floor. Evelyn moved quietly, dusting the shelves one by one, her thoughts drifting as they often did when the work was repetitive. It was a room full of youth, sketches pinned haphazardly to corkboards, books stacked in uneven towers, a model of a suspension bridge half built on the desk. It felt lived in and deeply personal, a world far removed from her own. She reached the tall bookshelf by the window and began to wipe each shelf carefully. That was when her hand froze midair. Sitting near the edge of the second shelf, tucked between a row of architecture textbooks and an old leather-bound journal, was a small wooden horse. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs, and the rag slipped from her fingers and floated soundlessly to the floor. She stared at the toy as if it were a ghost. It was small enough to fit in a child's palm, carved from pale maple, its surface smooth but worn from years of being held. On its flank, barely visible now, was a faint scar in the wood, a slip of the knife she had made years ago and never sanded down. Her vision blurred. She reached out a trembling hand and lifted the toy, turning it over slowly. On the underside, where she'd once carved the letters with careful pride, the faint remnants of NC, Noah Carter, were still visible. Evelyn's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, clutching the horse to her chest. It was impossible. She had buried this part of her life 15 years ago. The hospital had taken Noah's belongings when they prepared his body for organ donation, and she had assumed they were lost forever. How could this toy, his toy, be here in Julian Hargrove's room? Her breath came in shallow gasps. The room seemed to tilt around her, the air too thin to breathe. Her mind spun wildly through possibilities, but every one led back to the same devastating conclusion. There was no other explanation. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped her out of the spiral. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, still clutching the toy, just as Julian pushed the door open. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes dropping to the small horse in her hands. "Oh," he said with a soft, almost wistful smile. "You found it." Evelyn blinked at him, her mouth dry. "I'm sorry, I was just— It's okay," Julian interrupted gently, stepping closer. "That little guy's been with me for as long as I can remember. I call it my good luck charm." He took the horse from her carefully, holding it with a reverence that twisted Evelyn's chest. "It came from the hospital. I was told it was a gift from the boy whose heart saved me and his mom." The room went silent. Julian stared at the wooden horse as if it held a piece of his soul. "I don't know who they were. No one ever told me their names," he continued, a small, thoughtful smile curving his lips. "But I like to think they were kind, brave, the kind of people who'd want someone else to live, even when they'd lost everything." Evelyn turned away, blinking back tears that burned her eyes. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and she pressed them to her chest as if to hold herself together. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she was that mother, that Noah was the boy whose heart now beat inside his chest, but the words lodged in her throat, too heavy to lift. Julian placed the horse gently back on the shelf, straightening it like a sacred relic. "I've had dreams about him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "The boy. I don't know what he looks like, but sometimes I feel like he's still here, like he's part of me." Evelyn couldn't stay in the room a second longer. She mumbled something about needing to finish the laundry and hurried out, her breath ragged and uneven. The hallway blurred as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She stumbled into the empty laundry room and gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. Every beat of her heart echoed with the same realization, louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. Noah's heart is here. It had never left this world. It had been beating inside Julian Hargrove all along. Evelyn pressed her palms to her chest and wept, Not the quiet tears of grief she had shed for years, but the deep, shaking sobs of a mother who had just found the impossible. Her son was gone, and yet he wasn't. His heartbeat still moved through this world. It laughed. It dreamed. It played Chopin in a sunlit room. For the first time in 15 years, Evelyn felt something stir inside the hollow that grief had carved out of her. Something raw and overwhelming and alive. Evelyn barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. The wooden horse burned into her memory. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Noah's small hands clutching it, felt the weight of his head against her chest, heard his laugh echoing through the narrow halls of their old home. And now, 15 years later, that same toy sat on a shelf in Julian Hargrove's bedroom, and Noah's heart was beating inside his chest. The realization had cracked something open inside her, and everything spilled out. The grief she had kept buried, the longing she had learned to live with, the desperate love that had never faded. But with that flood of emotion came another feeling she couldn't shake. Fear. What would happen if she told Julian the truth? Would he see her as a stranger invading his life? Would he recoil from the knowledge that the heart inside him once belonged to a boy who died on a rainy October morning? Worse, would Lillian, proud, icy Lillian, use it as a reason to push Evelyn out of the house and away from the last living piece of her son? The thought of losing him was unbearable. The next morning, Evelyn moved through her tasks on autopilot, her hands scrubbing and dusting while her mind spun in endless circles. Julian passed her in the hallway and offered his usual warm smile, but now, just looking at him made her throat tighten. Every gesture, every laugh, every absent-minded hum of a melody carried traces of Noah, not in a way she could explain, but in a way she could feel. In the kitchen, Martha noticed her distant stare. "You're quiet today," the older woman said gently. Evelyn forced a small smile. "Just tired." But they both knew it was more than that. Her unease only deepened later that week when Lillian appeared in the doorway of the laundry room. "I've noticed you lingering where you don't need to be," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "This is a place of work, not a space for idle curiosity. Do what you're paid for, and don't involve yourself in matters that don't concern you." Evelyn opened her mouth to apologize, but Lillian wasn't done. "You don't belong in Julian's world. You're an employee, nothing more. And when your tasks are finished, you will leave through the service door like everyone else." The word stung, but Evelyn found herself studying the woman in front of her, noticing something she hadn't before. Beneath the frost and steel of Lillian's tone was something else, something raw and trembling. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing the son she had almost lost once before. Fear of anything, or anyone, who might threaten the fragile life she'd built around him. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel anger toward Lillian. She felt an ache of recognition. They were both mothers shaped by loss, both terrified of what might happen if the past collided with the present. That night, Evelyn walked to the small stone church on the corner of her street, a place she hadn't stepped into in years. The pews were empty, the stained glass windows glowing faintly in the light of the setting sun. She slid into the back row and folded her hands, but no words came at first. Finally, in a whisper that trembled through the empty space, she prayed, "God, I don't know what to do. I don't want to hurt him. I don't want to lose him. Please show me the right thing. Tell me if I should speak, or if silence is my burden to bear." Tears slipped down her cheeks, warm and unrelenting. In that quiet sanctuary, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not an answer, but a stillness. A sense that, for now, she didn't need to know everything. She only needed to stay. So Evelyn made her choice. She would keep working. She would dust the shelves and polish the silver. She would walk past Julian in the hall and smile when he smiled at her. And even if he never knew who she was, even if the truth remained locked inside her forever, She would stay close to the heartbeat that had once lulled her little boy to sleep. It was enough, for now, just to be near him. Julian found her in the garden one crisp autumn afternoon, kneeling by the hydrangeas with a pair of pruning shears. The trees around the Hargrove estate were aflame with color, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. He hesitated at first, as if unsure whether to speak, then joined her by the flower beds. "You're quiet," he said, crouching beside her. "I like that about you. Most people in this house are always rushing somewhere." Evelyn offered a small smile, but kept her eyes on the plants. Her heart still hadn't settled since the day she'd found the wooden horse. Every moment near Julian felt heavier now, more fragile, like walking through a dream she was terrified to wake from. "Can I tell you something?" Julian asked after a pause. "Something I don't really talk about with people?" Evelyn nodded. He drew in a breath, his gaze distant, fixed on the horizon beyond the garden walls. "When I was little, I almost died. I was 5, my heart was failing, and the doctors said there was nothing they could do. My parents were preparing for the worst." Evelyn's hands stilled on the soil. She already knew the story, but hearing it from his lips made her chest tighten painfully. "Then," Julian continued softly, "a donor heart became available. A little boy, younger than me, died in an accident. I don't know his name. I don't know anything about him, really. Just that his mother agreed to donate his heart, and that's the reason I'm still here." He let out a shaky laugh and looked down at his hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm living for 2 people. Like maybe part of him is still alive inside me." Evelyn turned her face away so he wouldn't see the tears welling in her eyes. Her breath came unevenly, her throat burning with the effort to hold back the sob clawing its way up. He didn't know. He had no idea that the boy he spoke of was Noah, her Noah, that the heartbeat keeping him alive had once lulled her son to sleep against her chest. Julian glanced at her and smiled gently. "Strange, isn't it? I feel connected to someone I never met. I think about him sometimes. I hope I'm living a life he'd be proud of." She wanted to tell him that he already was, that Noah had been gentle and kind, just like him, that his laugh sounded so much like her son's it sometimes took her breath away. But the words stayed locked inside her, too heavy, too dangerous to speak. That night, Evelyn returned to her apartment to find an envelope taped to her door. Her landlord's logo stared back at her in bold letters. She tore it open with trembling hands, and her stomach dropped. It was a final notice. She had 3 days to pay the overdue rent or vacate the apartment. The paper slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor. Evelyn sat down hard on the edge of her bed, the room spinning around her. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. The thought of leaving Burlington, of leaving Julian, felt like losing Noah all over again. The next morning, as she folded linens in the laundry room, Martha noticed her red eyes and trembling hands. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked gently. Evelyn tried to brush it off, but the older woman wasn't fooled. After a moment, Martha sighed, reached into her apron pocket, and pressed a small envelope into Evelyn's hand. "Take it," she said firmly. "I've been saving a little over the years. It's not much, but it'll help you get through this month." Evelyn shook her head immediately. "I can't accept this." "You can and you will," Martha said, her voice warm but unyielding. "You're meant to be here. I don't know why, but I feel it. And remember, the darkest night always comes before the dawn." The words lodged deep in Evelyn's heart. She stared at the envelope, tears blurring her vision. Pride told her to refuse, but something stronger, something desperate, told her to accept. That evening, Evelyn stood in her small apartment, clutching the money Martha had given her. It wasn't enough to change her life, but it was enough to buy her time. 3 days had become 3 weeks, and in those weeks, she would stay close to Julian. She would listen to the heartbeat that had once belonged to her son, and maybe, just maybe, she would find the courage to decide what came next. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the house was empty and Evelyn was dusting the upstairs study. A stack of leather-bound folders sat tucked away on a shelf behind a row of books. She wasn't one to pry, but one of the binders slipped as she wiped, spilling its contents across the floor. Evelyn knelt to gather the papers, careful not to crease them, until her eyes caught a familiar phrase. Cardiac transplant, October 10th. Her breath stopped. She froze where she knelt, her fingers tightening around the page. The rest of the document blurred before her eyes. Julian Hargrove, age 5, congenital heart failure. Donor heart received on October 10th, 15 years ago, the same day Noah had died. Evelyn pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes, her whole body trembling. She didn't need any more proof. The wooden horse, the warmth in Julian's smile, the Chopin nocturne, they had all led here. But now, in black and white, the truth stood undeniable. The heart beating inside Julian was Noah's. She sank into the leather chair beside the shelf and let the tears fall. All the years of aching emptiness, the endless nights spent whispering Noah's name into the dark. And now here is the proof that a part of him had never truly left. The sound of footsteps behind her made her jolt. "I see you found it," Martha's gentle voice said. Evelyn turned, startled, clutching the papers as if caught doing something she shouldn't. But Martha didn't look angry. She only sighed and eased herself into the chair across from her. "I knew who you were the day you walked in," Martha said softly. "I was at the hospital that night. I was there when they brought Julian in, and I was there when they told you your boy was gone." Evelyn's lips parted in shock. You saw me?" Martha nodded. "I'll never forget it. You stood outside that operating room, holding that little wooden horse so tight your knuckles were white. And when the surgeon asked if you were sure if you really wanted to donate Noah's heart, you whispered, 'Yes, let him live.' I've carried those words with me ever since." Evelyn covered her face with her hands, a sob breaking free from her chest. Martha reached across and took her trembling fingers. "You should know something else," she continued. "When Julian was little, he used to have this recurring dream. He'd tell me about it after his naps. Said a little blonde boy would come to him in a meadow, hand him a small wooden horse, and say, 'Live for both of us.'" The word struck Evelyn like a bolt of lightning. She had whispered almost the same thing into Noah's ear the night she kissed him goodbye. "Live, even if you're not here." And now, it was as if that message had crossed some impossible boundary, passed from one soul to another, carried by the beating heart they now shared. That night, Evelyn walked through the house with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. The fear was still there, fear of being pushed away, of breaking something sacred. But beneath it was something stronger, the certainty that Julian deserved to know something of the boy whose heart kept him alive. She found him in the parlor, sketching at the coffee table, the wooden horse resting nearby. "Julian," she said softly. He looked up and smiled. "Hey, Evelyn, what's up?" She hesitated, her heart pounding. "I want to tell you a story," she said at last, sitting down across from him, "about a little boy I once knew. His name was Noah Carter. He was 8. He loved fishing with his grandfather and reading pirate books under the covers with a flashlight. He had a laugh that could fill a whole room." Julian listened intently, setting his pencil aside. "He sounds like a good kid," he said gently. "He was," Evelyn whispered, her throat tight. "He was brave, kinder than most grown men I've met. And he had a heart bigger than anyone realized." For a moment, silence hung between them. Julian seemed lost in thought, his fingers brushing absently against the little wooden horse. "I don't know why," he murmured, "but it feels like I've met him before." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat and offered a trembling smile. "Maybe in a way you have." It wasn't the whole truth. Not yet, but it was a beginning. And as Julian smiled back, Evelyn felt a fragile thread of peace weave through the ache in her chest. The first hint of healing in 15 long years. Julian couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Evelyn's words again and again. Noah Carter, 8 years old, loved fishing, loved pirate books. Every detail echoed somewhere deep inside him, as if tugging on a memory that wasn't his but still lived within him. And then there was the wooden horse, the one he had carried since childhood, and the dream that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. A small blonde boy placing the toy into his hands and whispering, "Live for both of us!" By morning, the truth had crystallized so clearly it left him breathless. There was only one explanation, and when Evelyn arrived that afternoon to dust the parlor, Julian was already waiting. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Evelyn froze, her heart stumbling against her ribs. "Of course," she murmured, setting down the duster. Julian's eyes searched hers, steady and unblinking. "It was you," he said softly. "You're his mother, Noah's mother." The room seemed to tilt. Evelyn gripped the edge of the sofa, her breath shallow. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence between them heavy and alive. Then, with tears already rising, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "It was me." Julian's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn took a trembling breath. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of hurting you with something so heavy, afraid of being pushed away. I didn't want to intrude on your life. I just wanted to be near you, to know that his heart was still beating in this world." Julian's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "All those years, I wondered who he was. I used to talk to him, the boy whose heart was keeping me alive. I thought maybe he could hear me somehow." Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. "He can," she said. "Every beat of your heart, it's a part of him. And I'm grateful every day that it's still here, still living, still you." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, a woman and a man bound not by blood, but by the heartbeat of a boy they both loved. Julian crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her shaking hands in his. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a chance, for choosing life for me when it meant losing everything." Evelyn brushed a tear from his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for carrying him forward." That evening, Julian made a decision. "They need to know," he said. "My parents. This isn't just ours to carry." Evelyn hesitated, but then nodded. "All right." The four of them gathered in the grand living room just after sunset. Richard Hargrove sat forward in his chair, his brow furrowed with concern. Lillian stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, but her composure wavered when Julian began to speak. He told them everything, about the boy named Noah Carter, about Evelyn's sacrifice, about the wooden horse and the dream. And finally, he said the words that broke the room open. "Her son's heart is the one that saved me." For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard rose slowly from his chair and crossed the room toward Evelyn. His eyes were wet, his voice unsteady. "How do you ever thank someone for something like that?" he said quietly. "You gave us our son. You gave us his future." Evelyn shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I gave away what was left of mine. You gave his heart a future." Lillian hadn't spoken a word. She stood frozen by the fireplace, her face crumbling as the truth sank in. And then she turned to Evelyn, her voice breaking. All this time I treated you like you were beneath us. I called you a stranger. I pushed you away. And you're the reason my son is alive." Her knees buckled, and she covered her face as sobs racked her body. Evelyn crossed the room and took her trembling hands, and for a moment they simply held on to each other, two mothers bound by loss and love, by grief and grace. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered again and again. "I'm so sorry." "There's nothing to forgive," Evelyn said softly. "We're both mothers, and we both love the same heart." The two women embraced, clinging to each other as if the weight of 15 years of sorrow might finally lift if they just held on long enough. Around them, the house was silent, not the cold silence it once held, but something gentler, sacred. A silence born of understanding. And for the first time, Evelyn felt the ache in her chest ease. Noah was gone, yes, but his heart still beat in Julian's chest. It had built bridges, softened anger, and healed wounds. It had brought two families together, and in that embrace, Evelyn understood that love, real love, never truly ends. It only changes shape. In the days that followed that evening, everything changed. The air inside the Hargrove house felt different, warmer, softer, lighter. The cold distance that had once defined Lillian's presence melted into something far more human. Richard began checking in on Evelyn in the kitchen, asking if she needed anything. Even the staff, once careful to keep their distance, now treated her with quiet reverence. It was Lillian who spoke first about what came next. "We don't want you to leave," she said one morning over tea, her voice still carrying the poise of a woman used to being in control, but now threaded with vulnerability. Not as an employee, as family. Evelyn blinked in stunned silence. Family. Richard nodded. "You've already given us the greatest gift anyone could. We'd like to give something back, starting with paying off your debts and helping you find some stability, if you'll let us." Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. For so long, she had carried her grief alone, convinced it was her burden and hers alone. Now, these people, the ones who had once been strangers, were offering to share it. She whispered a trembling "thank you," her voice breaking mid-word. Life began to reshape itself around this new bond. Evelyn stayed on, not as the housekeeper who kept to the shadows, but as a living part of the household. The days no longer felt like work. They were spent cooking meals together, walking through the gardens with Julian, or sitting in the music room while he played the piano and she told him stories about Noah, his love of pirate adventures, his fear of thunderstorms, the way he'd once declared he would be a fisherman astronaut when he grew up. Julian listened to every word as though he were gathering fragments of his own soul. "It's strange," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, "but when you talk about him, I feel like I remember it. Not with my mind, but with my heart." Evelyn smiled softly. "That's because you carry part of him, and now he carries part of you, too." Their bond deepened with every conversation, every shared moment. They spoke of music and memory, of grief and grace, of futures both of them had once thought impossible. Julian began asking her opinion on his architecture projects. Evelyn, in turn, asked about his favorite composers. It was as if two lives, separated by tragedy, were slowly weaving themselves into one. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden watching the leaves fall, Julian turned to her suddenly. "You know," he said, his tone careful, almost shy, "I never really felt like I could say this to anyone. But I want to say it to you." Evelyn tilted her head. "Say what?" Julian hesitated, then let out a small breath. "Mom." The world seemed to stop. Evelyn's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Tears filled her vision faster than she could blink them away. "Say it again," she whispered. He smiled through his own tears. "Mom." She reached for his hand, clutching it tightly, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions, grief and joy, sorrow and healing, all tangled together. "I never thought I'd hear that word again," she whispered. "Thank you." From that day forward, it became their word, not to replace what either of them had lost, but to honor what they had found in each other. Lillian and Evelyn, too, began to forge a bond neither of them had expected. They spent long evenings together on the veranda, talking about motherhood, loss, and the ways love changes over time. Once adversaries, they became confidants, bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to love a child so deeply that you'd give anything, even your own heart, for them. And in that shared space, something remarkable happened. The past no longer felt like a weight pulling them down. It became a bridge, one built not from grief, but from love. A family that had once been divided by tragedy now stood united by it. And in that unity, Evelyn found something she had thought she'd lost forever: a home. The years that followed were not marked by the heavy weight of grief, but by the quiet strength of purpose. Out of pain, something extraordinary was born, a legacy that carried both Noah's memory and Julian's future forward. Together, the Hargroves and Evelyn created the Noah Carter Foundation, dedicated to helping children with congenital heart disease receive life-saving care. Evelyn, though she preferred to stay out of the spotlight, was named the foundation's honorary director. Her story of unimaginable loss transformed into hope became the heartbeat of the organization. At every fundraiser, Richard would speak of the anonymous gift that had saved his son's life. And Lillian, once guarded and distant, now stood beside Evelyn, introducing her not as a former employee, but as family, the mother who made our son's life possible. Their partnership, once unimaginable, became the soul of the foundation. Julian, now a licensed architect, chose to dedicate his career to the same cause. He specialized in designing pediatric rehabilitation centers, warm, light-filled spaces where children recovering from transplants could heal not just their bodies, but their spirits. His first major project was built in Vermont, just a few miles from Evelyn's home. "I want to be close," he told her with a smile, "to both of my moms." On what would have been Noah's 23rd birthday, the foundation made its most significant contribution yet, a donation of state-of-the-art cardiac equipment to Massachusetts Children's Hospital, the same hospital where Noah's heart had been transplanted into Julian all those years ago. Evelyn walked through the familiar halls with trembling hands, memories flooding back of that terrible night, the beeping monitors, the cold sterile light, the unbearable silence after the doctor said he's gone. But this time, those halls echoed not with sorrow but with laughter. Children chased each other down the corridors. Nurses pushed carts of toys. And at the ceremony, Julian stood before the crowd and spoke words that made Evelyn's heart swell. "This place gave me life," he said, his voice steady. "But it was Noah Carter who gave me a heartbeat. This gift, this building, is for every child who deserves the same chance I got." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Evelyn heard only the rhythmic thud of Julian's heart when he hugged her afterward. It was steady and strong, and it was Noah's. Life unfolded gently from there. Julian fell in love with a brilliant cardiologist named Emma, a woman with kind eyes and an easy laugh. They married in a small ceremony beneath the maple trees on the Hargrove estate, and when their first child was born, a little girl with bright blue eyes and a cry that shook the world awake, they named her Evelyn, in honor of the woman who had made their lives possible. Time, which once felt like an enemy, became an ally. Seasons passed, and with each one, the scars of the past softened into stories. Stories told over dinners, shared at foundation galas, whispered to little Evelyn as she fell asleep in her grandmother's arms. The family that had once been fractured by tragedy was now bound together by something unbreakable. On a golden afternoon in late October, Evelyn sat in the garden behind her cottage in Vermont. The trees burned red and gold, and the wind carried the faintest chill of winter. From the porch, she could hear laughter, Julian chasing his daughter across the grass, Emma calling after them with a smile. Julian stopped to catch his breath and sank onto the bench beside her. As he did, Evelyn closed her eyes and listened. There it was, the heartbeat, steady, strong, familiar, the same rhythm she had pressed her ear to when Noah was a baby, the same heartbeat that had lulled him to sleep, the same heartbeat that had once stopped and then gone on. She smiled as little Evelyn ran into her arms, her laughter ringing through the autumn air. "Grandma!" the girl giggled, nestling against her chest. Evelyn held her close and kissed the top of her head. Noah had never truly left. He was here, in the laughter of a child, in the warmth of a hug, in the steady drum of a heart that had carried on when everything else had fallen apart. He lived in Julian, in the foundation that bore his name, in every life touched by his gift. Evelyn looked out at the garden, at the family she never thought she would have, and felt peace settle gently around her like the falling leaves. Noah wasn't gone. He was just living differently now, in a world his heart had helped shape in a future filled with love.